is actually taken on board. And we encourage you to like our page on Facebook. It's called Are We Transforming? And most of our videos are on the YouTube channel, Are We Transforming with Tembekile Felicia Makubele. I think you can be able to give a lot of inputs even there. So over to you, Dumisani, and thank you to you and your colleague, Victor, for making this possible. I learned a lot through these preparations, so thank you so much. Over to you. Please unmute.
Yes, okay, I've done that.
All right.
Thank you very much, Felicia. It's highly appreciated. I think one of the things that propels societies to move forward is the ability to have conversations, tough conversations about itself, and trying to find answers in terms of how do we move forward. It's interesting that this conversation takes place a day after the Heritage Day. And I must say it's almost a sad thing to observe what happens on a Heritage Day but then it speaks to the mentality of our society. Those that are powerful, those that have got the means of productions, those that control thought processes, opinion making, and all of that. And those that are not necessarily in that space. So if you look at what happened yesterday on Heritage Day, most people thought by wearing the Tonga attire, Siswati attire, a Zulu attire, reenacting some of the battles that Shaka went through, King Shaka went through, by that very same act, they were inherently celebrating their heritage. Now, from my book, that's just a mere event. Your being African, your heritage is daily, it's weekly, it's monthly, it's every moment of your existence. But the fact that that which is African is limited to one particular day, and the majority of Black people believe that by wearing African attire, they are celebrating their heritage. It's an indication of how far away we are from freedom and liberation for Black people in South Africa. The day that we will have to celebrate a Heritage Day, which is worth celebrating, it will be the day that Africans are celebrating ownership of land, that they are living in the land that their forefathers have left for them. That's the real heritage. The cattle, basically the material and the identity belonging that they should be celebrating. So I thought I should just pass that through. But if you look at how we celebrate holidays in this country, it's a reflection that says Black people in this country are not in charge of the thought processes of their own destiny, of who they are in terms of identities and the way they should be going as a people. This is why we celebrate a day and call it a Bride Day. There's no meaning, but that's deliberate. But if the rulers in the country are not in charge or driving public opinion, identity creation and making and sustainability in the country within the African perspective, it definitely tells us that we are not necessarily a people that are liberated, a people that are in charge, a people that are in constant control of the pace and direction of our own becoming and being. And those are the things that get missed out on the Heritage Day. So having said that, let me come back to what I have been asked to address today. Today, I've been asked to speak about arrested liberation and the prospect for Black people in South Africa now and into the future. I must indicate that a much detailed topic which I was given by Felicia, it has three elements to it. One, it was, what was the liberation about? Number two, what were people promised in 94 through CODESA? And number three, what has happened to those promises that people were made, but that they were made to Black people in particular in South Africa. So the way that I looked into that particular topic as presented to me by Felicia, it was clear to me that we're talking about an arrested liberation. I'm using the term arrested liberation because the outcomes, the intended results of a liberation struggle have not been observed at this point in time. So we are not in the liberation. So as much as you can celebrate April 27, which marks the first time that Black people were allowed to vote as the Freedom Day, that freedom remains elusive. It is more expressed rhetorically than in reality. So those are the issues that we are going to address. So let me start with the end of this presentation. The end of this presentation is meant to argue for the following status: that the post-94 socio-economic character of South Africa, it is not the outcome of the liberation struggle. That's the sum total of what I'm going to address myself to today. So if you were to switch off at this point in time, that's the conclusion that I'm going to make. So, and what has happened in South Africa is that there was a liberation struggle, but in 1994, we landed at liberalism. And there's a serious difference, there's a fundamental difference between liberation and liberalism. So what is it that Black people fought for all these years? They fought for land restoration, because land is not just, contrary to what is being touted today as about productivity. Land is about belonging, it's about an identity, it's about spiritual, physical, it is the real heritage, so to speak. So that was what, when the liberation struggle started in this continent in particular, and South Africa for that matter, is about the restoration of land. Or if you want to put this in a policy perspective, it was a redistribution of land. So people were meant to be restored to what makes them their being and what makes them to be what they are, which is the essence of identity, their connection with their ancestors, their spiritual being, but also their livelihood, and also the increase, the going on of the generational transmission of knowledge and heritage. So when we talk about land, we're talking about all of those issues. So that was the liberation struggle was all about. But beyond that, it was about land redistribution. Because if there was some land which is unused, but subsequently there was a disproportionate use of land or access or ownership of land, the liberation government was expected to redistribute the land beyond what the land ownership has been at some point. So that's a liberation agenda. In essence, we are talking about a better quality of life, particularly for Black people, but then also the restoration of a dignified humanity of Black people. So if you read a whole lot of Steve Biko's quest for liberation in Africa, he will tell you that, you know, we want to give the world the essence of humanity. So in other words, when you have got a liberation movement such as the African National Congress leading that agenda, along other organizations such as the PSC and the Black Consciousness Movement, they were given one particular mandate as liberation fighters at the liberation movement to secure or to seize the state power and use the levers of the state and the resources of the state to do this thing that I've mentioned about land restoration, land redistribution, the building of the quality of the life of a Black person, a Black man and woman, and also the elevation of the dignity and the humanity of mostly the deprived people. So in other words, through the liberation struggle, the ANC was not necessarily mandated to take over government and become a facilitator or a mediator of interclass or inter-race struggles post-94. It was given a specific mandate, capture the state power, and generate an agenda, a program, and the resources, and deliver a better quality of life, particularly for those that have been deprived. And I will not go on to define what Black people are, because if you don't know what Africans are in the southern tip of an African continent, then you have a problem of identity. But then what happened in 94? In 94, we ended up with liberalism. So liberalism will say you have individual rights, it's you must be given fairness, you must compete fairly, you must be yourself, you must have freedom of speech and freedom of articulation. You can choose a government of your choice and they hold them accountable and all of that. But if truth be told, in South Africa, liberalism is not about individual rights. The way that liberalism has manifested itself in South Africa is that it is a conservative agenda to sustain and maintain the socio-economic patterns of apartheid. It has nothing to do with individual rights. So if you look at if you look at political parties, such as the DA and the Freedom Fund Plus, their particular agenda is to make sure that those that have benefited, the racial minorities of this country, particularly the white racial minority, sustain and they keep in check what they have owned over the years. It has nothing to do with individual rights. In other words, for South African liberalism, there is more propaganda than the substantiveness of reality. So it creates an impression. The liberal agenda says Black people are poor because they are not skilled, for example, or they are not doing enough to uplift themselves. And those that are white in the minority, they want to sustain their livelihood, is because they are applying themselves into doing what they ought to be doing. So in South Africa, we have got a very fake approach to liberalism. It's a selfish, it is a self-sustainable thing. It's about conservatism of that which the white constituencies in this country want. It has nothing to do with individualism for everyone, equal rights, access to opportunities, and all of that. It is highly inclined to sustaining what the white minorities for a very long time, have acquired illegally, immorally, unethically for themselves. And it's very important that we mention this because what the ANC in particular failed to appreciate on CODESA, I think Felicia must talk about CODESA. It's because CODESA was not made by the liberation forces. It was not initiated by liberation forces. CODESA was established by a predominantly white Afrikaner intellectuals who, in their own analysis, came to the conclusion that apartheid, maintaining apartheid through force, is very expensive. Because if you maintaining apartheid through force, it meant that the apartheid regime has to constantly throw in security forces, Emalokshin in Soweto, Sishiro, Leboahomo, Emlazi, Wamasho, Ekukuletu, all of that. So it was very expensive. Number two, it practically meant duplicating public facilities was equally very expensive. You can't, where there are 100 people who live together, have 4 toilets, one for black men, one for white men, another for white women, black women. It was particularly very, very expensive. But also it was becoming an international, a global nightmare because the media was able to show the brutality of the security forces globally. So in a way, the apartheid regime had to constantly justify itself, both in terms of its spending materially, but at the same time, in how it justified itself internationally. So the apartheid machinery was too expensive, both materially, ethically, and morally. But so to change that, the apartheid masters, the intellectual base of apartheid, like the Afrikaner Brotherhood, they came with a position that says, how can they restructure apartheid in a manner that it does look acceptable without them spending too much money or having to justify themselves morally globally. So there was the crisis of apartheid domestically and internationally. So how did they change that? It was simple. Speak to the ANC. So suddenly there were trips to the ANC in exile in Lusaka, and then somehow the idea of negotiation started. But as far as the apartheid masters were concerned, negotiations did not mean a change of heart. They were just changing the terrain of the power struggle. They were not necessarily changing. There was no, change of heart. This is why Mandela battled with the issue of reconciliation post-94, because it was not about that. There was no change of heart. And secondly, there are recordings that show former President Jacob Zuma saying that they negotiated in good faith, but the National Party did not negotiate in good faith. But then that was not negotiating in good faith, it was actually negotiating in naivety, because there was no way that a matured liberation movement of revolutionaries of about 80 years old should have easily believed that these apartheid masters have changed their hearts and minds. Suddenly, they want all that is good for all of us. It's impossible. That thought should not have been entertained by revolutionaries who have been in the struggle over the years. In any event, these were people that had lived in exile in countries such as Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, and they had witnessed what has happened post, the liberation struggle in those particular countries. So there was no way for liberation forces to accept that, the apartheid masters suddenly have a change of heart. Nada. It was not. If I met Jacob Zuma today, I will say that you did not negotiate in good faith, but you negotiated in naivety. So what happened in 94? In 1994, that is where the real post-94 state capture took effect. And I know that most of you think state capture is a product of Jacob Zuma and his faction with the Guptas and all of that. The real capture of the post-94 state, it took place during the Codeso time. So what are the hallmarks? There are two things that mark the capture of a state. One is the constitution. The dominant the dominant powers in a society, they capture the state by putting clauses in the constitution that favor them. They don't capture the state outside the constitution. So let's have a few examples. Number one, the property clause that crippled, or what we say, Eswatini, it castrated the post-liberation, the post-1994 government from redistributing the land or any economic activities for that matter. So this is why 25 or 26 years later, you still have a liberation government, because that's what the ANC, contrary to what Tito Mboweni says, that's the governing party. The ANC is not the governing party. The ANC, it's not even, the ANC is a liberation party or a liberation government because it carries a liberation mandate. And once you begin to say it's a governing party, it's a ruling party, you water down its historical mission. So when CODESA entrenched the property clause, then the state was castrated, the post-94 state was castrated from redistributing the land. The second aspect was the independence of the Reserve Bank. It particularly meant that once you render the Reserve Bank independent, which means the independent of government control, then economic activities and monetary policies in the country cannot be subjected to that which is defined or determined by a ruling, or in this particular case, a liberation government. The third one, they were very clear that they wanted an independent judiciary so that the judges, all they do is to interpret the law, regardless of who benefits from that particular law. So this is why most of the cases that the AfriForum takes to court, they win it. Because the judges are not expected to drive, the judiciary is not driving any transformation agenda or liberation agenda. It is interpreting a constitution which has been agreed upon. So this is why in most cases, AfriForum take the ANC government to court and they win because pre-CODESA, the masters of apartheid have decided that they are going to create this facade that says we are all free and the judges are independent and all of that. And then the other aspect which had to be put in place as an independent body is the Independent Electoral Commission. Now, if you look at all of these things, this is where the center of power resides. Now, once you capture the nature and the character of this particular institution, then it is immaterial who becomes a president of the day, who becomes the ruling party of the day, because you have already captured this in the pillars of power expression and interaction within the state. So this is where the real capture took place. You can even look at, for those of you who are interested in construction, you have to have some CIDB grading, but your CIDB grading is determined by how much money you have, you know, how well structured your institution is, you know, how many people you have, equipment and all of that. So the real capture of a post-94 state in South Africa, it took place during CODES. Now, this informs this reality which I'm painting to you, that 94 did not necessarily mark a change of attitude from those that ran apartheid. What 94 did was the white masters of apartheid, who claimed the right to themselves to determine the new nature of power contestation. And the new nature of power contestation post 1994 is who has got enough political, economic muscle to go to court with very acute and knowledgeable lawyers to capture the outcome. Those of you who are in tourism, said last week, there's been a decision that says BEE codes cannot be included in the revival agenda of the tourism industry. So the courts made, you know, a judgment in favor against the BEE. At the same time, the same week, which is very telling, UNISA also lost a case against its position on Afrikaans as a very key element, you know, in the teaching and all of that. So they've been instructed to reinstate that. But you can't blame the judges because the constitution itself, which the ANC as a leading liberation movement has agreed to in 94, 96, that's what it says. And the constitution says the judges are simply there to determine, I forgot the actual word that should be using, to interpret the clauses of the constitution. But what has happened, whilst the game, the rules of the game have changed in 1994, those that benefit from the post-94 rules of the democratic game, one are people who have determined the rules of the games themselves. So in most cases, if we're going to play a game, those of us who determine the rules of the game are most likely to win the game because we have set up the rules of the game. So the rules of the game set in 94 at CODESA do not express the intent outcome of a liberation struggle. Instead, they castrate the liberation agenda. So this is why, and the propaganda says we have the best constitution in the world, but we never ask for who. This constitution doesn't serve a liberation agenda. It's a conservative constitution earmarked to sustain the socio-economic patterns, you know, of apartheid. So what then happens? So if we understand the power relations and the contestation for power, it is very clear that the negotiations at CODESA were not necessarily negotiations. They were a struggle for how the power relation will pan out post-94. That in terms of disputes, who is going to determine the outcome and what are the rules that need to be followed? And unfortunately, these rules that were set through CODESA are not necessarily the rules that assist in the attainment of the liberation agenda. And just to remind you a bit of the liberation agenda, is that the restoration of land to predominantly Black people, a redistribution of land, better quality of life, and at the end of the day, the restoration of the dignity and the humanity of the Black man and woman. That's the liberation agenda. So that agenda, it remains intact now, but it has been weakened because during CODESA and post-CODESA, all the leftist forces in the country, they have been, castrated. I can mention COSATU, the SANCO, and in the main, the bulk of liberation forces, those that were steeped in this idea, somehow they were castrated post-94. So what has been the character then of this post-94 South Africa, particularly for Black people? What we have seen post-94 is that there's been a development of a Black middle class. But here's the problem of this Black middle class. It is a very, very non-productive Black middle class. It is a as Zanele will say, it's a highly non-progressive middle class. If we add that to that, it's a highly consumptive Black middle class. It absorbs, it chows from the state apparatus, the state resources, without necessarily building into the progressiveness of the state. Now, why is this the case? Is because this Black middle class, it enjoys the status of a Black middle class materially for two particular reasons. One, because such persons hold high position within the ruling party politically. But secondly, because most of these people are within the state apparatus. So they are not in the industry, they're not in the private sector. Those that are in the private sector are not necessarily in a productive private sector. So at the end of the day, we have what is called in other African countries a comprador class, particularly in countries such as Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, that were led by the Portuguese at some point. And that is where the problem, because we turn out as Black people to admire our fellow Blacks on the basis that they drive big cars. We don't admire them for what they produce. We admire them for what they drive, what they drink, what they do during the Durban July, and it's just a consumptive glitterati class, unfortunately. So that is the middle class that we have. But the worst part is that this is also the middle class that tells the Black masses that, look, don't worry where you are, things will be fine. We will get to you eventually. Now that's a serious problem. So we are dealing with a stagnant middle class of Black people. Now, Samora Machel says the most difficult thing about fighting a class struggle post the independence is that the very same people that you are supposed to fight, they are family members. They are members of your family, they are members of the ethnic group, your cultural group, your traditional group, and that in the process, whenever there's something of a class dispute that has to be dealt with, chances are your own family will call you to the rural home and say, why are you so jealous against your brother? So we are scared. We can't fight the class struggle post-94. We can't fight the class struggle post-94 because there's this emerging class that looks like us, speaks like us, dresses like us. Come the Heritage Day, they will wear shibelani like me, but avunula njengesiswati like me, and then bayovunula lento begqokwa ngushaka and the spears and all. So they are one of us. Mm. How dare then do we fight our own people? So that's the problem that we have in this country, that it's as if we have reached a plateau of the liberation struggle. I know for those of you who lose weight, do weight loss program, there are some point where you easily lose 10 kgs, but at some point suddenly you are not losing weight anymore. And they call it a plateau. So that is where we are at this point in time. So what are the prospects? Here's the challenge of South Africa at the moment. The problem of this country, it's among many others, is not necessarily the inequalities, the joblessness, and all of that. We know that's there, it's factual. The problem is that we don't have a political leadership that is willing to bite the bullet and be decisive and refuse to impress the powers that be. You know, a political leadership that is going to say, here I am, I carry a liberation mandate. My mandate is to liberate Black people socially, economically, and politically, and that is what I am going to do. So there's a tendency in this country to speak about change without wanting to upset the status quo, which is crazy. So if you look into the build up to NASREC, elective conference of the ANC, both NDZ and the CR17, they had a similar approach to land expropriation without compensation. They said, we'll do this thing, but no one will be adversely affected. It's crazy. If you are going to take more people into a bus, which is already full, some people in the bus must either get out of the bus or allow others to sit on top of them. So people will be affected, but we don't want to say these things. We want to say, so it's like there's more inclination to do that which is good for those that are in control of the material resources of the country, rather than uplifting those that are poor and are in dire straits. It's like the first priority is, let me not upset Van der Merwe and his farm. But the fact is, next door, you have a homeless guy. And for you to deal with this landless, homeless guy, someone who has got the land must be adversely affected by that decision. So that's the problem that we have. And if you check all over the world, there's never been a society that has grown exponentially without a progressive, decisive political leadership. And I interact a lot with political people, and they tell me that, no, in this country, Black people must unite, and what. That's not where it starts. You need a progressive political leadership first, and then people will follow. And I can give you two examples. In 1994, a whole range of Black people rallied to vote for the ANC. That is evidence of unity. There's never been an absence of unity of Black people in this country. Back at some point during election, the ANC was given a 2/3 majority. What other evidence of unity of Black people would one need beyond people who go and vote for that? So if you are told that Black people must unite, please tell whoever says that Black people have been uniting for ages. What lets them down is a Black political leadership that when it gets into power, it ceases to think strategically, and it follows the exactly same processes and systems and patterns of governing established by the colonial apartheid masters. It is that lack of decisiveness and intervention that happens in the post-94 period that gets us into the status of where we are. So there's lots of literature, by the way, that says those who had benefited from apartheid have benefited 10 times more post-94. Because I think we have a political leadership that is more of political administrators than innovative and decisive and saying, this is what we need to do. So what do I foresee in the near future? I think the patterns of poverty, homelessness, and landlessness among Black people, they are likely to continue. That's what's going to happen, unfortunately. Perhaps we will come to a point where, as Nico Mabunda says, when we all are at a point where we have nothing else to lose, we will begin to think what is in the interest of a greater good. But until then, as long as we have the type of leadership that we have, we will continue to have the problems that we have. So what you need to do as an individual is to recognize that your own existence is predetermined on how you interact with other people. So I can't say to you that, you must develop your skills to know your job and all of that. The fact is, as sociologists says, as human beings, we are sociable beings. You can't prosper on your own. But perhaps when we must accept the reality that for things to change, time may come where we may have to fight our own cousins and the nieces and brothers-in-laws and on a class basis, not on an ethnic basis. Thank you very much, sis. Much appreciated.
Wow. I am blown away. I'm sad at the same time, because reality, I think, is facing us on the face, and being in the government structures also, I get to see some of the things that you're talking about. I think that is one of the reasons that made me to want to start this this platform. Maybe as people are thinking about what kind of comments and questions they would want to pose, you already answered the question that I was about to ask as to what is it that as citizens we can do? Do we wait up until we have that, political leadership, which probably will be forever, considering that the middle class is forever being lured into staying where they are benefiting and becoming role models to the younger ones? I think another question will be, you spoke about actually the generational transmission of knowledge, which will be a heritage for the young people or the new or the coming generation. How do we as citizens? My take is that I think there is something we can still do, despite having the leadership that is not necessarily, addressing those mandates that they were given at the time of us, or them fighting as Black people. I'll say us fighting. What is it that we can do?
Yeah, no, thanks a million for that question. I think there are things that we can do. Number one, we need to understand how the system operates. We need to understand how liberalism operates. The reason why the AfriForum, and for those that are living in Gauteng are familiar with Outer, they usually win their cases in courts against government because they understand how the system operates. So so as Black people, we must navigate. When do we go to the street to toy and put rocks on the road? But at the same time, are we engaging the system? So we need a few things that need to happen. One, when I say we need to understand how the system works. One, this is what I'm referring to, the governance system. it's important that we know how governance, there's a difference between government and governance. Government is a structure, but governance is the processes and systems. And if you look at most of these white dominated institutions that get their way against government, it's simply because they understand how governance operates. Next to that, which is a subsection of that, we need to be familiarize ourselves with the policy, legislative, and regulation making. You know, when Parliament goes on to some energy, let's say energy policy, right? They get to a point where they say, we are releasing a green paper. The question is, how many of us engage with that process? How many of us look into this document and say, no, but this 0.13 is not good for Black SMMEs? No? So we need to understand the process of, lawmaking, policy making, regulatory making. But in the same vein, we must forcefully participate in that process. So it doesn't make sense if Parliament says we are opening this process for public hearings, and then we don't go and Black people don't go. But then also, it's not just about mobilizing Black people with placards. It's about understanding the technicalities of policymaking. So we must contribute at that level, which means, I guess this one, we must be very privy to lobby and advocacy. We must have a very strong sense of lobbying and a very strong sense of advocacy. Now, unfortunately, what I'm going to tell you now is not nice, but in my interaction in policymaking, lobbying, and advocacy, I've come to a conclusion that Black business organizations, Black professionals, they don't want to invest in research and development.
Mm.
So we still rely a lot because, okay, I am Dumisane, I was in prison with Moses Tembe, and now that Moses is the DG of what, things are just going. It doesn't happen that way because a liberal state like this one, this liberal state, it is the contested state institution.
Mm.
The ones who get what they need are the ones that have the capacity to intellectually, technically engage with the state. So unless we darkies get into that mold, and we believe because my cousin is now a minister, things are going to happen. It won't happen. If my cousin as a minister does something for me, the SIU will be on his neck or her neck. So we can do this thing. We can know the system, work within the system, deal with the system. I mean, it was very irritating for me when there were public hearings about land expropriation without compensation, where you see a whole line of Black people, a whole queue of Black people who grab a mic and start talking. That's not what you need, because someone else will interpret what you say. Develop a proper document, technically, intellectually, lobby and advocate and follow through. And that's not what we're doing. So this is why you will always get upset when the AfriForum wins a case against government. But they do their homework on how the system operates. Are we doing that? I'm not sure. So I think that's the way to go.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, without me and Dumisani having a dialogue, if you have any questions, please indicate by a show of hand, or I will also pick you because I can see your names, just for you to indicate. But as you are thinking, how do we then, you froze, can you still see me? Okay, how do we then make sure that the youth participate in this? I don't think they even have an idea. I always complain about the public participation approach, which is currently being used. which is meant only to achieve the APP targets, the annual performance plan targets by government.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we then make sure that they also become part? And I think issues of finances will also come in for those who would want to participate in the lobbying and educate themselves. I would love to educate myself because I can see that complaining will not necessarily change anything. But if I have an opportunity to do something, let me do that. There are two hands. Let me just notice the two in that particular order. I'll start with Shadrach Nkuna, and then the next one will be Mr. Jabuma Bobo. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and my greetings to Mr. Tembe, and thank you very much for such an informative presentation. But what triggered my curiosity about the whole thing, it's when you indicated that the real state capture took place during CODESA by coming up with the constitution that doesn't in any way improve the socio-economic conditions of our people radically. Now, when I compare that statement with the fact that at one point, I think immediately after the 1994 elections, ANC on its own had a two-third majority that enabled it to, they could have changed the constitution if they wanted to and directly deal with the section 25 in the constitution, the property clause, if they felt that it was a hindrance to the restoration of land in our country. So my question is, what in your view were the considerations why the ANC did not change the section 25 in order for it to be in a better position to redistribute the land? That for me will be the first one. The second one will be related to that. Careful reading of section 25. You get a sense that that can be used to redistribute the land, because amongst others, it says land must be redistributed when it is in the public interest. Then state may pay a particular amount for it that will take into account certain consideration how a person acquired the land, for what purpose would be the land, for what purpose is the land being redistributed. Now, that is the second thing. For you, thirdly, and hopefully this will be the last.
Yeah.
You indicated that to use your weight, one of the ways in which the state was castrated was, amongst others, the insistence that the Reserve Bank must be independent. We've got two groups within the ANC, although they cannot, this characterization in public, they will not necessarily agree with. We've got what we call the Radical Economic Transformation Group and the so-called reformist within the ANC. Now, the RET group is saying, no, we should have, if it was within us, we will have nationalized the Reserve Bank. But if you look at it objectively, you will realize that 10 years, for the past 10 years, actually, the nationalization of the Reserve Bank has always been part of ANC policy, even when Jacob Zuma was in power, who allegedly is part of the RET forces. they could not nationalize the Reserve Bank. Why is that? Why do I mean, what do you think that was the case if really there is a real need to nationalize the Reserve Bank, unless if it is one thing that is being used to whip the emotions of the people? Thank you very much.
Would you would you want to take the next question?
Yeah.
Or okay. Okay,
No,
over to you.
let me answer Nkuna, because Nkuna believes in 1 man, 4 votes, or 4 questions. Nkuna, I'm happy because Nkuna, he in his articulation of these matters, he's very clear about it. He has got also answers, and I think I agree with some of the answers. So let me start with question 4. The one about the Reserve Bank and the construct and opinion about radical economic forces and the reformists, and the assertion by the RT forces that they can easily nationalize the Reserve Bank. I usually joke, Nkuna, when I say that I struggle to find the force in the RT forces. A particular dissenting faction against the dominant faction time, which is led by me with an ideological basis, and I have struggled to find that. And secondly, I think the RT forces' biggest weakness is that they do not have a leading pillar that they can rally around. So they can't use, because if you are going to have to be a worthwhile faction within the ANC, you or any other organization, you need to have a particular person that you can rally all your issues around. So number one, JZ is no longer that person. JZ, this has been a president of the NC, he's done that, he has left, got his t-shirt, it's done. Secondly, they can't rally around the NDZ because NDZ is not necessarily interested in factional politics. She contested and then she accepted the outcome, and she's gone with that. But I think the RT forces, they find this discourse useful because constantly they have to put a stain on the dominant faction. So I am not convinced that if the so-called RET forces were to take over, they will necessarily nationalize the Reserve Bank. Remember, these are not new people in the ANC. They have been there for ages, for months, for years. When the ANC had a 2/3 majority, they could have done that. And then what you call the reformists, I agree with you. They go along with the most conservative political economy forces in the country. They are more what I call a textbook economists. They are not necessarily going to change the Reserve Bank. So this is what can, so here's the biggest problem, Nkuna. If there has to be some radical, in fact, the term radical economic transformation, it has got some serious internal contradiction. If it's transformation, it can be radical. Anyone who uses the term radical next to transformation, there's no such thing. The people who are going to speak seriously about change, they are going to use the term change and they are going to use the term redistribution. Those who are going to constantly use transformation, transformation is a liberal term. It means you are tapping lana. You are not changing the substance of what needs to be changed. So the real radical people that are going to rise within the ANC, they will talk about a redistribution. That's what they are going to talk about. And anyone who uses transformation is just, managing the waters. But here's the thing that makes, maybe I should leave it at that point. But forget about nationalization. Within the ANC, there's no political cohesion around what needs to be done. And I think by and large, very soon the ANC might cease to be an organization, but a collection of individuals and groupings that are using the same institutional parameters. So I hope I have answered that one. But in summary to your question, the last one about the Reserve Bank, I think rather than seeking to change, the factions in the ANC, they use various rhetorics to deal with the other faction. They are not necessarily motivated by changing things. They are motivated by an interest to subdue their competitive factions. But then they will use all of these things on the floor to use them. Secondly, okay, I will combine your question 1 and 2 because the issue of state capture. When you see within liberal politics, the people who benefited the most are the ones that lay the basis about how the state is going to function. And the only way you do that and how the state is going to function and what are the parameters of the state is at the development of the constitution. That's one. The development of policies and the regulatory framework. But policies and the regulatory framework have to be aligned to the constitution. So you cannot have a constitution that's done and have a state capture at some point, because the state capture, when you capture the workings of the state, it must be aligned with the constitution. So this is why I'm saying to you that the real state capture was done at 94. The capture of the post-94 state was done in 94. What has happened during the Zuma era is that those that became arrogant about how they were close to the president and benefiting, they did their work very clumsily. So the difference between the various factions economically that capture the state in this country is their level of what's the word? Sophistication. The most sophisticated guys captured the state in 94 during Codes. These are the ones that came up later. They came up to grasp the crumbs. So if you speak to people at ESCOM, for example, they will tell you that there are companies with 20 years contracts. Now that's a real state capture, if you're asking from what I'm saying. Section 25, I fully agree with you. The reason why there's a weakness in land redistribution is because of the incapacity of the state from where I'm sitting. It's not illegal, it's not a constitutional matter. If the ANC was very strong as a government, so there's very strong capacity ideologically in terms of the political willingness and in terms of the bureaucratic operation, a whole range of land could have been far redistributed by now. So to put it unfortunately terms, even the change of this section 21, it will not accelerate Black people's access to the land, simply because the capacity within the liberation government is weak. Okay, we can go to Mabo.
Yes, over to you, Mr. Mabo.
Na cancer, man. On the platform. English. Thank you so much, Dumisane, for the insightful contribution in terms of transformation, which I fully agree. I want to add, you see, the challenge that we have.
You are cutting.
Yes, you seem to be breaking up. He's connecting with us from Zambia.
Oh, nice.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, can hear you now.
Okay. Now I was saying the biggest challenge that is facing mainly South Africa, it's the economic development that is still being driven by government. And connecting with the points that you are raising, what comes out even much more clearer is that with the internal fights of a government that is supposed to be leading or giving leadership of transformation, it's itself entangled in fights. And as a result, the masses that are supposed to be guided and led are not being led. So as a result, you have young people that are looking forward and aspiring to be, let me go into politics, maybe I will change this, I will change that. And yet the minority that have been driving and have been benefiting out of the economy are still growing and they are not touched. You raised a very good point in saying, are we able to use the system to fight our battles? We use the streets more than using the systems and in following things to the latter and in challenging what is in the constitution. And if you look at the very essence of the capturing of the constitution, it's what we have as a political, as a election system in South Africa. I mentioned it last week that every 2.5 years, we go into votes for local government and later for national government. And we have our focus on who do we put into that leadership position so that we can continue to benefit from the tenders. Secondly, you touched on a very important issue on our black middle class. And what has elevated black middle class, the business community in particular, benefited not necessarily because most of them worked hard from ground up. It was out of policy change and getting the BEE shares and being now lifted up to that middle class. And transferring that wealth to be generational still becomes a challenge from our black brothers. They've become golfers, live in security estates, and as a result, the connection with the townships becomes now a challenge. And you try and ask a simple question, why don't you interrogate? Most of those that are in the middle class are dependent on the very same government for sustaining their middle class. So they can't buy the hand that feeds them. The third aspect is that the over-indebtedness of our black brothers. That middle class is not sustained on real accumulated wealth, but on credit worthiness. The bond that we have, the car hire purchase that we have, the food that we buy through credit cards. So for you to become now a voice that will lead the transformation, you are thinking privately, if I'm fired, what will happen now? I've sent children to school in here and I want to maintain this kind of lifestyle. So we have become more of individuals that are using that government, that proximity rather to the leadership of government, not to advance that which the ANC as an organization aims to achieve, but that which I can benefit when I'm associated with this organization. So I wanted to add into that to say, if we don't have business, black business that drive economic development and assist government in implementing this, and you go into the space which you touch, research and development, I asked a question the other time, sorry to be looking like haphazard. I said, we have COSATU that is the custodian of the workers. But is COSATU preparing their workers to face the real evolution of technology and the ICT that is taking place? Because you say you must not fire employees, but are you skilling the employees to be able to be relevant to what is required in the industry? Are we using the SITAs as government to train the employees to say, let us prepare that in the event there is change, you are not found wanting. But instead, we are still saying government must be pro-poor, it must be pro-workers, but the world is dictating otherwise. Are we moving with the trends of the world, or are we stuck in being a liberation movement that as long as I have bread on my table, I'm fine, I'm still maintaining my middle class, then I will use my brothers and sisters for votes and continue to sustain the status quo. And if that continues, unfortunately, Heritage Day celebration will just be attire, and we will continue to be looking at our brothers and sisters, and the situation will continue to be worse and worse. And as a result, we will never have peace. It will be continuous violence and protests. I submit.
You see, one of the key things that you have said there, Mabob, if you check most of the civil wars that have taken place in the African continent, they have happened because there's a relationship between being in government or being in a political office that has control over government, over access and control and distribution of resources. So if we continue in this trajectory, in a situation where in this country, the private sector is not necessarily generating enough economic activities to employ a whole range of people, it means being part of a government, or any level, local, provincial, national, it means it is the only way to enjoy a particular level of livelihood. You get, so what happens is that then people begin to fight over state ownership. So in KZN, for example, there are a number of people who are getting killed because they have been nominated to be councillors at the local government level. If you check at most of the provincial elective conferences of the ANC, they usually end up in court over this contestation, because being part of a government in this country, it means access to resources. It means having the ability to distribute it through patronage resources. So I appreciate your addition. I'm just putting that, adding that danger, that unless if we have a political leadership that is able to grow the economy, to build SMMEs, to make young people to be self-sustainable economically, we will continue to have a situation where the ruling party become a center of empty factional contestation without any policy direction. And ultimately, people will kill each other to be in government, because if they kill their competitors in government, they will be able to take over those positions and be able to enjoy a better life for themselves. That's if you check most of the civil wars in the African continent, they are about access to government positions because they allow access to resources and patronage networks.
Yeah, before I comment, let me take Maburi. You raised your hand. Please, the floor is yours. You can raise your question or comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chair. And we really are empowered. And Dumisani, this is really mind-boggling. But then I'm concerned with the youth in South Africa. Based on what you said, I'm just asking myself, how then can we really empower our youth to close this gap and be able to transform the situation? And number two, I'm also concerned about the role of our parliament, the different parties within our parliament. I even answered myself to say maybe it's because of the majority of the ruling party. Hence, most of the parties that sees the light do not have a way to change this narrative. So I'm just worried about the role of the different parties within our parliament, as well as the youth. Thank you.
Maybe before you respond to that, I think it was Shadrach who said that political parties actually talk about things that they know will be like the citizens will be emotional about. And because of lack, I think some of the things that you were saying, I believe those who are going to even listen to the recording will be hearing it for the first time, or they have been ignorant about it. This picture that, or this narrative that we are always putting on the table of saying whoever that has got money is considered to be powerful, and not necessarily people that can be able to assist us, you know, to move from where we are now to a different place, over and above us, you know, creating opportunities for people to know about the system, which I'm not even sure how we're going to be able to do that, because looks like people are not even interested in anything that has to do with government, except how they're going to get money to buy clothes. I was watching things on TikTok, and you can see that young people are interested in the dance, in buying clothes, and, you know, the cars. The unlearning and the relearning, how do we go about doing that as citizens who have got, like last week Mr. Mabobo indicated, we have to group each other together who are like-minded, who are interested in specific things. Like now, people who are in this platform, I'm assuming that they are also interested, and they can also play a role one way or the other in making sure that we change the narrative without us being, you know, in politics. So how do you go about doing this? I think you can couple that with what Mavuri was talking about. Over to you.
See, Felicia, the problem of making a presentation there, it comes with the assumption that you have the answers.
Yeah, I know, but not necessarily. Others can also come up with those, yes.
Look, you know, okay, so the first question by Lepuri says, how do we empower the young people? I'm a great fan of mental disposition. I think the things that we do, they are predominantly because we are of a particular mindset. Those that are in the spiritual world thinking, they will say that, you know, you have a particular spiritual disposition, and physically you manifest what your spiritual disposition says. I think part of the challenge in this country, we need to change our thinking around education. There's a book by, I forgot his name. The book is called The Age of the Unreasonable Man. What in that book, what he says is that the future, those that will survive in the future are people who are willing not to follow the normal procedures. That you are born, you go to creche, primary, high school, you go to varsity, you get a job, you get married, you have kids in the home, and that's it. That's that. So he says that's not the future. That's when, he was the first guy to talk about disruptors, to say that people who are going to not follow the usual, those are the people that are going to be successful. And he said that we need more of those. He even gives a horrible example of some boy who came back home and found his entire family burnt in the fire, was left alone. And he became a big guy because suddenly he was confronted with the situation that said, how do I make life, becoming life, for me? And then he started to do things that were not necessarily doneable through that node. And he calls that a discontinuous change, a change that has nothing to do with the past. So as long as our education system says you must chase after a certificate and you will be employed, then we are going to continue to have the problem of young people. But besides that, the fact is that young people are very, very creative. But then when they come to government offices, they are then subjected to lengthy bureaucratic processes when they are very, very creative. A simple example, I mean, you remember the Rhodes Must Fall statue. When these young people went to them, started to say this thing must be moved from the UCT, the Minister of Arts and Culture says, no, we have got processes and system and consultation that had to be processed. When all of us could see that this colonial structure has no presence in a democratic South Africa. He says, no, there are processes that must be system, a consultation, and all of that. It's the same thing that happened with the name change Tshwane from Pretoria to Tshwane. You have to follow endless processes, court battles. Now that's the process. Young people want to move and get things done and all of that. I'm convinced that many young people that I've met, they don't want handouts, but they want to be listened to. But then do we have an institutional arrangement, a bureaucratic system that enables innovation, creativity that comes with the hyper energy of young people? I am convinced that that's not necessarily the case. You still have to go through, the ANC structures and meet some regional leader to be taken seriously. And that's the problem. The second one, the role of parliament. So if you study multipartism, they will tell you that what happens in parliament by MPs is a reflection of the quality of the party where they come from. You cannot divorce the capacity of MPs from the political party where they come from. Similarly, you cannot divorce the performance of ministers, MECs, from the party where they come from. So if you have a political party that's main character is factional battle and a revolving door, you will have MPs that are more concerned about their own individual preservation rather than their representative mandate. And in this country, we like to pretend that there is no connection. There is the quality of the MPs, they mimic the quality of the political party where they come from. And if you are constantly having leadership battles within where they come from, they will go to parliament and their primary focus will be to impress the dominant faction where they come from. So they will not deliver according to the mandate of being a public representative. They will be there to sustain themselves. And I think there was an MP who said during the state capture hearing, when she was there, she said, look, I was there to advance my party's, mandate. Then she was asked, didn't you know that this was wrong? She says, yes, but I had to carry the mandate of my party. So if you want proper capacity MPs, then build a very strong political party. It can be weak in itself and send a strong parties and people in parliament. It doesn't work like that. That's why the Communist Party of China is very powerful in government, because organizationally it is very powerful. So, Felicia, I don't know how to answer your question about unlearning and learning, because I agree with you. At this point in time, we are wired. And to unlearn, you must first accept that I don't know much. And I need to begin to learn. So at this point in time, I don't think we're at that stage where we have accepted that we are not the best at what we do, we need to change. So the first point of departure is to accept our ignorance on what we should be doing to grow as a people. And then from there, we might want to learn different ways of doing things. Part of, now that I'm talking to you, I think part of the problem is that we are in a country where we don't value the knowledge and creativity of ordinary people on a daily basis. I'm sure if I were to go to Seshiko and sit with women who are selling fat cooks and all of that, I can get some serious, brilliant ideas. There was an instance where in Gauteng government they built houses, but it didn't speak to the people that they thought they need houses. So when they finished, people didn't move into the houses because people were saying there's no economic activity there. What am I going to sit there? So if I'm going to sit there and I'm selling tomatoes at Maboneng, I still have to spend 40 rands to and from every day. Now that 40 rand, I can buy bread with that. But because, the expert thought they know what the people want, so they went to build houses where people found that, it will be very costly to live here. So no one moved in there. So perhaps maybe government needs to unlearn being too knowledgeable over the people and find time to listen to the masses.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of things that are being done without the people being involved, and no one complains. People just continue with their lives, money wasted, and more money will be given to the tenderpreneurs for them to build again another one that will now satisfy the needs of the people. Masilo, you wrote something on the chat box. May you please say it so that for record purposes, people can also be able to listen, because the comments are not necessarily included in the videos. I would appreciate.
Right. Ish, I didn't know, and I was about to type another one. Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. Yeah, there are many points that one would raise. Just that I don't want to sound academic, but I mean, the presentation was quite good. Of course, I mean, there are also problems of historiography, in terms of what counts as a liberation movement, and the concentration around apartheid just as the fundamental antagonism. Yeah, but I guess my contestation is around concept, really, concept of liberation, concept of liberalism, of neoliberalism and apartheid. So yeah, I was wondering if I mean, that can be clarified because as far as history is concerned, the ANC wasn't really regarded as a liberation movement, unless one reads, the Road to Democracy, which was, sort of a product of Thabo Mbeki and others, in terms of promoting the role of the ANC in the so-called liberation movement. But yeah, the point was that the ANC was regarded as a civil rights movement. So Buku in founding the PAC was quite clear about that. And I believe in the 1980s, the struggle between Amavarara and Amazimzim was quite, expressive of that tension that the Azapo, the PAC didn't really regard the ANC as a liberation movement, at least since the founding of the PAC. So that's the one part. The second part is really about liberalism. So my sense is that there's a distinction between liberalism and neoliberalism. So historians such as your Eddie Maloka in a book called Friends of the Natives, he makes a clear analysis of the rise of liberalism in South Africa, calling liberals friends of the natives, tracing them, of course, to the missionaries who were dealt with by, the likes of Nozi Majeke in the role of missionaries in conquest. The whole historians of the non-European unity movement. But neoliberalism is a specific sort of, economic system that emerges around the 1960s with, economists such as von Hayek. I think Friedman, who was a student of von Hayek, then promoted it in the States. But it's an economic system that emerges around the 1960s. We know with Margaret Thatcher, Humbeck, apparently, if you follow Gumeda's book about the soul of the battle for the soul of the ANC, Mbeki, who embraced it through GEAR, made that transition from RDP to GEAR, and then he said famously, "Call me a Thatcherite." So there's a distinction between that. Of course, the Constitution itself is a liberal document. It's based on liberalism. It marks the triumph of your Helen Zayler. They were clear from the Liberal Party to the Progressive Party to Democratic Party to Democratic Alliance. It's a clear liberal project of the Friends of the Natives and the white, settlers as a whole. With regard to the last part around apartheid, I think that it goes back to the liberation movement. Your Biko talked about the totality of white power. Your Sobuka mentioned, the primacy of title to territory when they used the metaphor of here is an African tree, here's an African table. So apartheid wasn't really a fundamental contention, but the fundamental contention was white supremacy, was racism, was white settler colonialism. And the last part was with regard to CODESA. Yes, I mean, I agree with the presentation that to a certain extent, the Verlichte, which are called liberal Afrikaners, sort of made the initiative to sort of talk with the ANC with regard to the new transition. Of course, they were informed by, historical debates that emerged, around the 1960s with the liberals and the new leftists. Bennett Makubane and Mary Lepton wrote about this, the whole argument around the compatibility between apartheid and capitalism and whether or not the two are not compatible. Of course, your Esther Hayes, your Sam Peter Blanche, your Alistair Sparks, your Patrick Bond. These are some of the white scholars who wrote about this, in terms of showing that it wasn't a black initiative. We know that your Clarence Makwetu and others were against, joining the, CODESA and other things in Azapo. So yeah, maybe if the presentation can sort of, deal with this kind of contestations. I have other points with regard to the Constitutional Court. The critique of the Constitution. I mean, I agree with it to a certain extent, but from a jurisprudential perspective, of course, there's a contestation. You have your Calcler who talk about transformative constitutionalism, the idea, your John Dugard at Wits who talk about how the Constitution in terms of its socio-economic framework can be used, to deal with the issues of inequality and stuff, and the Azanian critical tradition, which makes clear that the entire constitutional framework has to be abolished because ordinary people were not involved, and it doesn't use the epistemology epistemological paradigm of the indigenous conquered people, because Ubuntu and Abantu are not mentioned in the constitution. So these are some of the contestations that we can deal with. I mean, the fact that, you know, just when blacks were about to get into power, because the constitutional court as the Supreme Court was as the highest court was introduced, as opposed to earlier when we had the Supreme Court, the doctrine of constitutional supremacy, which was one of the 34 principles contained in the interim constitution, which had to be adhered to during the certification judgment. Maybe that can be sort of dealt with. Thank you.
Okay, you don't necessarily have to respond to everything, because clearly Masilo is one of those who reads and familiarize himself with a whole lot of different ideologies.
Yeah.
I'm just worried that in you responding, you'll get too technical, and we might end up losing. You know.
No, I won't. I'll be in
Right.
2 minutes or even less. Look, I think actually I'm very grateful at that contribution, as much as other contribution is extremely useful. But it pains me a bit. It pains me a bit because the only way that, not the only way, the one way that this government, the quality of the Black people can change in this country is when those that are knowledgeable, both in terms of history and conceptual orientation and thinking and innovation, can be brought to the fore, and they contribute to that level. So someone like Mashilo, for example, and the rest of us, can make this contribution that is making. It will create into the mind of a bureaucrat that says, here's what we are doing, and we are doing it because of these historical purposes. The only reason that one of the reasons that the National Party was sustainable as a government is because it relied on the, what is this, in the African Broederbond, which was an intellectual base. So the question for me is, to what extent does this liberation government uses the intellectual capital that the Mashilos and the rest of us are having to sustain progressiveness moving forward? So that's part of, so it's when I listen to colleagues here articulating some very brilliant ideas, it gets a bit upsetting, because I don't think this knowledge is being tapped by the ruling party. I mean, we have a ruling party that does not have a research institution, which means they're not investing in knowledge generally, and therefore they cannot do greater things without investing, in knowledge. The last part, though, about Mash, just maybe we can have this conversation with Mashil at some other point, but not necessarily today. I'm still very uneasy about academia. I've come to a conclusion that the academia that we are subjected to, that we go through, it still uses the tools that were designed by the West for the purposes of the West. The education system that we go through from I'm old school, I'm going to, from crash, to the university, and the degrees that we have, they still manifest the interest of the source of where it comes from. So sometimes we use this education system to unpack our condition, only to find that the tools and the knowledge paradigm do not correlate. So let me just throw that, you remember the summit we attended, I threw the same thing to the VC of UNISA. I mean, I once did a thesis, and when I used Julius Nyerere, he was not considered an intellectual or a philosopher. But when I used Plato, it was easily accepted, even the races like Immanuel Kant. So I'm beginning to have some serious question marks about, the utility of academia in growing Africa forward. But that's the question for another day.
Yeah.
I'm sure that, look, this is why we have the National School of Government, when we have got universities with degrees on public administration. Why would we have a National School of Government that empowers bureaucrats when we have got universities that are supposed to produce public servant professionals?
Yeah.
So we need to revise the meaningfulness of the academic methods and means of solving our issues.
Yeah, I'm actually excited at what you have just said, that you would want to have a situation where not necessarily you and Masilo only, but where we'd have people who are knowledgeable about these things to have sort of a discussion, a roundtable of some sort, where we can be able to discuss. Look, we're going to develop a report on all the issues that have been discussed, but I just want to request you to, in closing, there's a lot of take homes. I've got 6 pages that I've written already. And I believe there is more that I can still get from you through interaction on a one-on-one basis without us being on a platform, as I'll be developing a report, because the part of research, I agree with you and I see it where I'm currently working. The understanding thereof of what research can do is not at the level that you have explained to us. I don't think the issues of letting the public understand the system is even pushed. It's like, you don't have to know, we know it for you, so we are fine, because when you start knowing, then you start questioning, which is something that I think we can be able to do away with. So, colleagues, if there's nothing that you have for Dumisani, I would ask him to just, yeah, I'm blown away. Say in closing.
Look, in closing, for me, it's been a learning session for me. Yeah, it's been a learning session for me. I'm grateful for the invitation. And some of the issues that have been raised here, I'm going to think about them, develop some articles there and there. My final point is that the government that we are subjected to, it's a very technical government. We are living in an age which is called a knowledge society. So we are living in a knowledge-based. We are being led by supposedly a knowledge-based institution. If we want, as a Black people, to benefit from this government, it is not so much what the governors in their own corners think we need to know and get. It's how we technically, knowledge-wise, lobby and advocate and become a serious players in what the government does to us. And we must remember that this government is highly contestable by various classes, various races, and what we're going to gain, it depends on how do we fight for our own space in terms of what the government does. We cannot sit back and say, these are liberators, they are messiahs, and they are the saviors. They will do things for us. We must research, develop articles, technically engage on what this government needs to deliver on the people. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'm just thinking, as you were saying, that I think South Africa is not, okay, government, I'll speak for government. Government is not necessarily having good knowledge management systems in place. And there's no sort of efforts that are being made to make sure that that is in place. People would leave government and come back as consultants because they don't create that knowledge-based kind of a situation where people will learn from whatever that they have experienced and change in future. So yeah, it's a big elephant. We'll just take it in small chunks, but the research one, I'm gonna take that up, and the advocacy one, I'm taking that home. I'm also taking the fact that we need to find a way in which we can accept the fact that we are not necessarily knowledgeable, and we should create those platforms for us to be able to get to know what we are. That will assist us to challenge the system as is, because we cannot continue having the 350 and thinking that people's lives will change, which is a topic for another day. We had it the other time. Somebody was saying that it's something that needs to be looked into. Dependency to government. I mean, we can, But thank you so very much for making time, and to Victor too for staying all this time. Thank you so much. Colleagues, thank you for making time too. Now we can release you to go and watch the last minutes of the game if you still
I'm at pains. I'm a Chiefs fan, but it's okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm a Pirates fan, so I'll quickly go and watch, or I'll watch the whole game later on.
All right. Thanks a million.
Thank you. All right.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye.
Meeting is adjourned. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Marcelo. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
You're gonna be our guest, Wena. We're gonna make sure you are.
Okay, thanks.
All right, sure. Bye, Mkateko. Victor, I will find a way. I don't know whether you should wait for, let me just stop the recording.